Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Oxford Speech for this Trinity term. Today we are especially fortunate to be joined by someone whose work and voice have sparked important conversations across communities, Yisrael Arthur. Through social media, he has gathered a following of hundreds of thousands, bringing insight and a willingness to engage with complex issues in a thoughtful and honest way. In a time where discussions can often feel rushed and polarized, his approach reminds us of the value of questioning and reporting on meaningful issues. Please join me in welcoming Yisrael. Thank you for coming. When doing my research about you, I found that you studied anthropology and law at the London School of Economics, and now run a social media news organisation and a non-profit empowering marginalised youth. That's an unusual path. What was the moment that made, I assume, formal legal practice feel insufficient?
I'd say, well, first I'd have to start with my sister. So when it came to selecting which university to go to, she suggested that just doing law by itself might leave me a little bit odd or strange or, half-baked in some way, shape or form. And so she suggested that I combine it with some other form of discipline. And that's where anthropology came into the picture. And as a discipline, I think it's quite a wide-ranging one. It forces you to confront some of your own preconceived notions and ideas, and it forces you, I think, to think, well, a bit differently, but also to challenge yourself too. Modules from anything from economic anthropology on globalization to the anthropology of revolution. And I think it took me rather through time and history and places, and it's quite an interdisciplinary discipline, if you like, and I think that was quite powerful. In terms of just law by itself, I feel like, you can do corporate law, you can go to a boutique law firm, you can do consultancy, as I think somebody told me before, and what you'll find is, the money might be good, the hours might be hard, you will probably become a better version of yourself in some way, shape or form. But I think you're not really testing yourself until you think about the world more broadly besides, you and your position in it. And, you might make your family's life better, you might achieve a form of financial freedom and independence. But I think I feel like that's a low bar to set for oneself. I think there's a lot more that you can do in the time that you've got here on Earth.
Of course. And when looking at your Instagram account and the news stories you choose to cover, how much does your identity shape what stories Novo chooses to cover? And is that something that you are conscious of?
It's definitely something I'm conscious of. I think when we first started, it used to be far more of my own views and thoughts and opinions infused into it. And then as time went by and as the platform expanded and as the sort of responsibility shifted, then it also shifted how I approached it to myself. So for example, just yesterday there was an attack in Golders Green, 2 Jewish men were stabbed, and I think all of a sudden you see all these different reactions from so many different people. Some will focus on one thing and leave something out, and you can never really reach everybody, and you can never really take in like the whole situation because it will mean something different to millions of different people. But I think it would be a disservice to the audience if I decided to only lead with my own perspective. I have my own Instagram account for that, and I think what we're trying to achieve, and what I'm trying to achieve personally, is to push people to think a little bit more critically, to engage in society, and the idea of being a citizen, I think, is something active, not passive. But I think something that we've seen in the last, decades and so on, is we've become a little bit, I think, more consumerist as things happen at a push of a button, is less of an incentive for you to engage directly, especially if some of the communities and organizations that might have once existed outside of the digital space no longer are so easy for you to access in a tactile way. And I think that makes it easy for people to sort of consume their way through politics, i.e. liking and sharing, which is part of it, but the idea is, can we push that a bit further? And to do that, I think you need to divorce yourself a little bit from the platform, keeping it within, ideals that you set, frameworks that you set, but without injecting it with too much of yourself.
It's interesting you mentioned your own Instagram account as a space for your own views. Do you feel any obligation to be impartial with Novo? And because most mainstream media outlets at least claim neutrality, does Novo make that claim, and do you think it should?
I think there's a difference to me. I mean, the way people use the two terms are sort of synonymous, but there's a difference between being neutral, if you like, and not taking a position on certain moral issues and problems out there in the world. And then and I think that's different to impartiality.
Yeah.
As in saying that you favor one group maybe or another, or you favor, I mean, I think that's probably the best way I can think of it at the moment in terms of 21st century politics. But because of that, I think the idea is, you know, we take a universal approach to, say, human rights. I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a great document for many reasons, but I think it also helps guide the sort of moral philosophy of Novo. And then in terms of how we present and what we report on, I think that can pretty much show you that we're not necessarily neutral when it comes to issues that we see in the world. So the platform isn't neutral when it comes to Sudan. It's not neutral when it comes to humanitarian crises anywhere from Gaza to you know, the streets here in places like Golders Green.
Speaking of Golders Green, in a recent piece you wrote on Medium, you warned about the unregulated consumption of social media, supercharging conspiracy theories, especially anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Isn't there, well, some would argue, isn't there something fundamentally contradictory about building a civic engagement platform on the very infrastructure that you're critiquing?
No, I don't think so. I believe that you have to play with the tools and the cards that you're dealt. I don't take the world as I want it to be or as I wish it would be. The world is the world. People believe in conspiracy theories. I think I've seen some surveys in The Economist and elsewhere that suggest that a good deal of the British public believe at least one conspiracy theory, sometimes several. And one thing that is hard to get to grips with is the idea that people, it's usually not just one theory or idea, it's an entire worldview. And that is an entirely different beast. So people have, if you like, intersubjective realities that allow them to function as normal human beings, but then, especially when it comes to pressure cooker situations or situations of great tension and disasters and wars and conflict and social issues, then some of that starts to break down a little bit. So I think using the platform is just, you know, that's where you meet people. I meet people where they're at. We meet people where they're at, and you can't just decide, okay, I'm gonna try and do it some other way, because then you wouldn't have anywhere near the influence that you might have. I think it's important to build offline spaces and communities, but in terms of efficiency, this is just the rules of the game.
And speaking of using Instagram as a tool, the Instagram algorithm specifically rewards short, emotionally engaging content. Does trying to game that algorithm inevitably flatten political issues or nuance? And at what point does a 60-second reel or a short form content become its own form of misinformation, do you feel?
I think that's true to a degree. I think, especially if you're taking anything and summarizing it, you do some form of flattening anyway. I think the important thing to stick with is that human beings are storytelling creatures. And because of the way the brain is, and it must conserve energy, it must make do with a limited amount of resources, scarce resources, and it has to make choice. Well, I'm giving it a personality, but if you like, it has to make choices about what it does and doesn't process. And the same way that you can't see the ultraviolet spectrum, or the same way that your brain is not necessarily wise to optical illusions, is the same way that that applies to millions of other people. And I think if we're meeting people where they're at, a lot of people don't necessarily have the same, background. Maybe they weren't in a house where there were books to read. Maybe they suffered abuse, or they had any of the number of challenges that might make it difficult for somebody to engage in politics in a way that's palatable or acceptable to somebody else. And I think if the medium that they find themselves consuming 20, 30, 60 minutes per day is one in which you can reach them and push them to challenge themselves, then why not?
Of course. And mindful that some in the audience also have their own questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'd like to move on to some specific issues that you talk about on your Instagram account. You talk a lot about Palantir. Now, Palantir's contracts within the Metropolitan Police and the NHS have drawn a lot of criticism, partly because the companies work with Israeli military operations and ICE in the United States. Of course, Sadiq Khan has also raised concerns, and there have been widespread public petitions to remove these contracts. Do you think that those contracts should be cancelled outright? And does your answer change depending on which institution we're talking about?
I think it'd probably change depending on the institution. I think, as most people know, when a company is tendering for a contract, there's a whole process, there's onboarding, there'll be, like for example with integrated care boards in the NHS, a process of people moving from an older system into a newer system and migrating data from one place to another. So I don't think an abrupt change or cancellation makes sense in that context. What I do think though is that you have, if you like, two key issues. One, you have a moral problem in terms of who Palantir chooses to work with and in what capacity. For example, Microsoft, after being made aware of some of the issues involved in the cloud computing use by the Israeli military when it came to what I think is genocide in Gaza and what UN inquiries and legal scholars and others have described it as. When it came to that, Microsoft decided to pull the plug. But what you don't have is Palantir, whose CEO, for example, and co-founder Alex Karp decided to, at the beginning of that response to Hamas's attacks on the 7th of October, decided to say almost unequivocal support for the Israeli government, despite even prior to that, the fact that you would be aware as the CEO, well, potentially, of the fact that the ICJ has given an advisory opinion in July of 2024 that suggests that the Israeli government's occupation is illegal. And if you have a government or if you have a company that's willing to work with that kind of government outright, almost seemingly without limitation, besides of course what they'll say in terms of their maybe their ESG policy and the like, then I think that raises moral questions. I think it raises moral questions when you see what politicians or bodies of the state, for example in America, decide to do with that technology. And then I think you have a secondary concern, which is the way in which the UK government and other governments in Europe have become increasingly reliant on US technology, on US insight, on US infrastructure. And I think in terms of the way the world is moving, where the US share of the global economy declines, and you might start to see conflicts over anything from water to data to automation to displacement, then I think it makes sense to sort of reconfigure how the government sees its reliance on the US.
It's interesting you mention government discretion. Recently, the Ministry of Defence awarded Palantir a £240 million contract in December of 2025 with no competitive tender. And it's been reported that Peter Mandelson helped facilitate it, given that his client, the client of his firm, Global Counsel, was Palantir. Does that connection concern you? And what does it say about how procurement works at the highest levels of government?
Well, I think one of the things that you hear people speak about in almost every community in the UK, but also globally when it comes to politics, is this idea of a moral rot, of the idea that it feels like, maybe it's not even true, maybe it's just nostalgia, but the idea that we've backslidden in some way, or that the moral clarity that we expect of political leaders seems to be a vanishingly small asset. And in the case of the Mandelson scandal, it, like other scandals before it, reveals a lot of things, I think, about the workings of the British government, of the British state. You have, for example, a man where we're all talking now about, due process and who put pressure on whom and whether or not cabinet office officials did or didn't do a particular thing. But ignoring all that, you had disclosure prior to this year and the year before about Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. You had information before and since about Mandelson's dealings in Russia, in China, about Global Counsel's lobbying for several big tech corporations. And I think all of these things pointed to at least some form of a warning sign that was ignored. And I think in a sort of short-term political cycle where you've got maybe the 4 years or the 5 years to do what you need to do, when you have issues in the polls and when you're facing all these forces, I can see that political expediency or a desire to deliver means that people might want to cut corners. But I think that almost inevitably leads back to a place where people are more disillusioned with politics and more angry.
Interesting. If anyone has any questions, we can move to questions now. Yeah.
It's really easy to become really hopeless when trying to address sort of political issues or any sort of issue that one feels sort of enthusiastic about or worries about on a daily basis. How do you envision effective civic action?
I think the first thing that people, or like I recommend people do, is to evaluate what their skills are. You know, can you sing? Can you dance? Can you rap? Can you design? Can you make videos? Can you speak well? Can you organize in some meaningful way? Can you volunteer an hour at a soup kitchen? Can you do something? And then I think it's about looking at where, based on those skills and that skill set and need, where you'd be the most effective. So if, for example, you're going to go for a high-paying job, maybe you're into effective altruism and you think charity is one of the best ways that you could give back, there's that. I think that's sort of low-hanging fruit, because I think you need sort of bodies in systems to make things move. But that's how I'd see that. And in terms of hope, I think it's kind of difficult to just, you know, from a fundamental level, look at how unlikely it is for you to be born in the first place. Look how unlikely it is for you to be here at this time, to enjoy all the fruits of, you know, many thousands of people and hands and places and spaces before you, and not think, you know, maybe I could also do something good or positive for, well, if not humanity, then my local community.
Any other questions? I'd like to move on to reform. You speak a lot about Reform UK in your videos, and they've faced scrutiny over MPs avoiding tax and accepting foreign donations. But they're also polling quite strongly. Does that suggest that the public doesn't care about political ethics anymore, or they care about something else more, perhaps?
I think the public does care. I think on one level you can look at Reform UK's polling and it looks you know, strong, but in another way, I think it also just reflects you know, a fracturing in British politics, where you have, you know, Reform UK are not polling 35%, 36% or 40%. We're talking about mid to high 20s, sometimes low 20s as well. And I think that does suggest that people still do care about standards, or do care about the things that would separate, say, the voting for a Reform UK candidate from maybe a Labour candidate, a Green candidate, Lib Dem, or even a Conservative Party candidate as well. But at the same time, I think the Labour government won a very efficient majority, 33% of the vote. There's a lot of people who don't vote too. So the system itself, I think, has some anti-democratic tendencies, and it does suggest that some people who would benefit from a Reform UK government are probably more enthused about the prospect of voting for that, even if it is to shake up the system or for any number of purposes. But I think the antidote, or the way of counteracting that, is to have effective policies, or to have a position that really deals and addresses with the fundamental issues that people say in polls consistently are the things that they're concerned about. And I think until you see that from a political party, then Reform UK's rise will continue unabated.
You mentioned an undemocratic system. Why do you think that is, and how do you think we can change that?
I think there's, well, fundamentally to me, if democracy is one person, one vote, then in analysing that, you have to look at everything else that shifts those votes, or maybe stops people from wanting to vote, or gives some people seemingly more influence over that democratic system. And we have, you know, it could be anything from the hereditary peers in the House of Lords, soon to be removed, although with a sort of deal allowing some of them to keep their powers. Or it could be in the fact that if you have a certain amount of wealth, you're far more likely to be able to, well, one, win public office, but also to be able to influence people. We know in the case of Reform UK, it's a party bankrolled, at least by December of 2024, according to Democracy for Sale, by, well, 75% of its donations coming from 3 very rich men, many of whom have wealth that's shielded, protected, or managed through a whole range of different institutions, shell companies, and foreign tax jurisdictions, and places that are considered tax havens too. And I think, is Reform UK's rise possible without that financial support? Is that financial support something that the ordinary person, or many people together, is capable of matching? Not necessarily. And then I think, if you like, the Labour Party for the first time last year had more donations coming from some of these private companies than it did from some of its union backers, or from some of its lay supporters as members of the public. And I think if you see that shift in politics towards increasing financialization and relying on private wealth, then you narrow the scope, I think, of democratic participation. if it costs however much to have lunch with Boris Johnson and you get a peerage at the end of it, then why should anyone really participate in the political process?
It's a quite nice segue into political donations because, of course, Reform became the first mainstream political UK party to accept Bitcoin donations. And their largest donor is a Thailand-based crypto billionaire who has given them £12 million of late. And the Electoral Commission has said that Reform hasn't shared its crypto wallet addresses, meaning the watchdog can't independently verify where the money is coming from. At what point does that stop being a transparency issue and start becoming a democratic integrity issue?
I think transparency issues are democratic issues. I think, again, if it's coming back to one person, one vote, and we look at the factors that influence that, if it's more difficult for me to understand why you have the policies that you have, then I am at a disadvantage compared to somebody else who might. What we know, say, when it comes to some of Reform's donations is, say, in the case of a £5 million donation, prior to the general election, prior to the fact that Farage had initially said he wasn't going to stand at all, and then he received a £5 million donation, ostensibly for his own personal security, and then all of a sudden his mind shifted and changed as well. We know that, for example, the chairman of JCB has donated monies to Reform UK, and then you have the advertisement of JCB products on leaflets going around the local area. I think if you don't know where your politicians are receiving their funds from, then it's difficult to trust, I think, what they're saying. I think it's difficult for people to trust that their policies are based on their own independent rationale and are not based off, even if not direct influence, then, you know, a sort of indirect form of persuasion that comes in the form of gifts.
And the government is now introducing a £100,000 cap on overseas donations and a ban on crypto donations, partly in response to Reform's fundraising. And in response to this, Reform MPs walked out of the Commons during the announcement. What does that tell you about a party when it actively opposes measures designed to prevent foreign money influencing British elections?
Well, I think it does what it says on the tin. I think patriotism in many ways is an easy word for people to say at the moment, you know, that I'm patriotic or I believe in Britain. But then I think if you like, and excuse the pun, you have to put your money where your mouth is. And if you're going to be somebody who says that you represent the best for British people and the best for the British electorate, then I think that also involves being honest by them. It means trying to engage as best as you can in being as transparent as possible and being as open as possible, and in allowing people to scrutinize you to the highest degree possible. I think if you're not accountable, then it's very difficult for me to believe that you're also going to fight for my interests, because I don't know why you believe what you believe, or why you say what you say, or why you do what you do. And when it comes to Reform UK's donors, we know that these are very rich and wealthy men of a particular background, of a particular education. And we know that there's policies, at least from my perspective, in the last well, it wasn't a manifesto, but a contract with the British people that contained things that, you know, in some ways might benefit the average person, but in many ways, especially in the medium to long term, pose risk, to say the least. Yeah,
definitely. And we'll move on to more audience questions. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. My question wants to take us back to more about you. Your delivery in your videos has such a very, very clear esoteric cadence that seems a bit poetic. I want to ask what your background is in terms of, you know, why you're able to deliver. As you're speaking right now, it's a poetic way to how you speak. I'm just intrigued as to what your background is. Do you used to make music, or do you
I wish I could rap. No, my father's a preacher. And I guess I watched a lot of him growing up. I watched a lot of preachers on TV as well, and maybe I absorbed some of that passively. And practice, I'd say. I gave one of my first speeches reading from a piece of paper outside an arms factory in Oldham, and then I would just, you know, keep practicing or keep doing it, and then eventually I could do it without a piece of paper. But I'm always trying to improve it, because I think you owe it to anyone that you're speaking to, really. It could be in a personal relationship, or it could be anything else, to try and become a better communicator.
Yeah.
When did you decide to go from a law and anthropology student and not go the orthodox, dare I say, route into law and then to branch out to the media and become a commentator? And why? What was there one trigger moment?
I see. Well, for me, I'd say in a way I'm sort of trying to do both concurrently. So right now I'm studying my solicitor qualification exams, and at the same time I'm trying to do this too. I'd say in terms of like, because there was a view in my mind up to a certain point that I was just going to do corporate law, I was going to make as much money as possible, and then I was going to give back to the world, if you like. I think we see the limitations of that all the time, from Sam Bankman-Fried to the Theranos lady, Elizabeth Holmes, I believe it is, too. And I think in terms of a personal way, the pandemic was a weird time, I think. I think we can all agree on that it was a very weird time. And, you know, I came from quarantine, I was put in a room for like 2 weeks, I came out, I was going to bed at 7 a.m., things were just getting weird. And in that time, my grandmother, my only surviving grandparent, I think, died too in Ghana. And then, you know, trying to find money to get an emergency flight for my mother. And then, this is weird, but Kobe Bryant died as well. And then that, for me personally, that was like a big, sort of like maybe somebody in the background of your life that you don't imagine is gonna die, or it sort of forced me to reflect on my mortality, I guess. And so in that period, it started becoming a thing of, you know, I've always had some of these ideas or thoughts or feelings, and how do I translate that from what's in my head or in my heart into the outer world? And I suppose that was the push, so to speak, yeah.
Yeah.
I think myself and the audience have seen like some of your most popular videos follow the format of who funds, for example, a person or what institution. I was wondering, like, following your investigation of that, what further steps can people take, knowing that, you know, what funds what, and sort of why do you think that's such an important question to ask as well?
I think it's a really important question to ask, because say you're talking about the origins of the Labour Party, say. Originally you're talking about very working class roots, you're talking about, you know, former miners, bus drivers, etc., who could rise to become top in the party. And obviously it still happens to a degree, you know. John Major famously didn't go to university, for example. But at the same time, I think you reach the limitations of that system anytime you have a new concentration of wealth in the world. I think one of the problems that we have is that in the shift from the sort of Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek's of the world and the Chicago School of Economics into a world with free markets and capitalism galore, and we're going to build these tech unicorns, and we're going to do it big and live it large. Somewhere along the line, I think there became, and I feel like this is an observable fact, that there became a huge disconnect between some of the people who own that capital and other people in a way that didn't necessarily exist, I think, maybe 50 or 60 years ago, because it was potentially, not always, but more difficult to avoid some of the worst excesses of poverty or humiliation or some of the things that flow from inequality in the world and in the place around you. People weren't necessarily so removed from the factory floor that they were immune to the concerns of the people who worked on it. And I think in this modern space or time, if you want to call it that, we're reaching new levels of wealth that we haven't seen before. By all estimates, Elon Musk is on track to become the world's first trillionaire. And obviously, not all of that wealth is liquid. You can't just spend 20 billion pounds or 50 billion pounds just like that. But at the same time, it creates almost like a gravitational pull. And I was reading in the Equality Trust, for example, that I think we're talking about orders of magnitude, thousands of times more likely for somebody who owns a company like that to be able to stand in public office or to be able to influence a particular district or area than other people. In America, the limits are obviously more extreme, but you see lobbying in intense ways to defeat, say, regulation of artificial intelligence technologies, or to, you know, fight back against environmental regulation. You had, you know, hundreds and hundreds, or at least 94 lobbyists coming back and forth with the UK government when it came to trying to restrict, I believe it was the smoking ban, but don't quote me on that, I'd have to double check. And if you have the money to spend, you can shift a lot. And I think more than ever before, a lot of people's livelihoods are so inextricably linked. One of the biggest impacts of globalization was that now no longer can you say, you know, what your pension fund does is so far removed from what somebody else does in another part of the world. You know, you look at, say, the Iran war and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and you see how very quickly that affects fertilizer prices, it affects the price of a cup of coffee in your hands. And if people are able to disproportionately influence that, then they hold not just sway now over hundreds of people or thousands of people, but millions and potentially billions of people too. I hope that answered your question.
Any other question? Yep.
You mentioned your father was a pastor. What role does religion play in your life now?
I'd say, personally, I'm not a huge fan of, it's probably a bit cliche, organized religion, if you like. I find it difficult to go and stand in a church, in a mosque with other people. I don't know if that's just a weird thing for me. But I believe in God in some sort. Maybe it's Spinoza's God, as opposed to an active, independent, you know, one that I feel is a bit more of a projection on the universe as opposed to the other way around. And I think really I take solace in the interconnectedness of it all. That, you know, at the atomic level, at the cellular level, we all, DNA, we all share something. We're all part of the same human family. You know, we all bleed blood, have hopes and dreams, breathe air, and we're all going to die one day. And I think in that, there's a huge amount of solidarity that you can just reap from that we are all connected in a fundamental sense. And I think when I think, or in terms of how I think about God, I think about that connectedness, that which binds us all and connects us all. And I think I take hope from that and strength from that too.
Any other questions? I do have one final question.
Go for it.
Novo started during the pandemic as a response to what you saw as a failure of civic engagement, people disengaged from politics, misinformed and perhaps politically apathetic. But looking at British politics right now, you have Reform doing reasonably well in the polls, record donations flowing into political parties, and younger people perhaps more politically activated than they've been in years. By some measures, civic engagement is actually up, or maybe not, depends what you think. So some may question, what exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve now? And is Novo still the right answer for it?
That's a great question. I remember meeting a man during, there was a series of protests called the Kill the Bill protests, and they were trying to defeat the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Act, or some variation of those terms. And it was during the pandemic, or towards the latter side of the pandemic, and he was talking about how he was coming to this march because he was against lockdowns, but he was for the vaccine, and he really wanted me to know that he was in support of the vaccine and he was in support of inoculating people against disease. But at the same time, he had, if you like, other views that are not necessarily reflective of reality. But it was still good to me personally that he was still out there, that he was still using his voice, and that he was still engaged in the democratic process. I think one of the biggest mistakes you could ever make is believe that because somebody didn't come to the table with the same views as you, or they didn't come to it speaking in the correct way or the proper way or anything like that, that they have less of a right to engage in the democratic process. I think studies on things like citizens' assemblies, on juries to some degree, if you want to take the Lammy Review from 2017, that these things can have a moderating impact on the worst excesses of the things that we tend to do to each other if given the opportunity. And I think because of that, if we can still get more people still involved in the political process, and if there's still people who aren't, then I don't think the job is finished. And in some ways, it might never be finished. If you do have more people getting involved in politics, maybe not in conventional ways like voting, but I think unless you start to see that increase in people showing up at the ballot box, in people joining organizations, then I think the job is not complete. And I don't think it ever will be, really, because it's an ongoing, active, everyday struggle.
Great. And finally, in your view, what is the future of Novo? What's it going to look like after your SQE?
Well, at the moment, what we've got is a pipeline of young people at university and the like who, so right now, our application to be regulated by Impress was approved as an independent sort of regulator of often new media, but also traditional media and the like. And what we're trying to do is get these young people who are coming in through the pipeline now and try and, if it's helping them get an internship, helping them get an internship. If it's getting experience presenting, then it's getting experience presenting. If it's helping us make like a documentary or some of the other stuff, then it's doing that. We've got a series coming out soon in terms of trying to get experts sort of in the room. Because you've seen, I'm sure like Diary of a CEO and things of that nature, but I don't have the same, always anyway, the same thing about this video needs to go viral. Yeah. It doesn't really at all. If it hits this many people, great. And because of that, I think there was a backlash against experts not so long ago. I think that receded slightly towards the tail end of the pandemic because people's family members started to die and they were wondering why. And then in terms of things like anything from the US and Israeli war on Iran to what's happening in Gaza or Sudan or Congo or Myanmar or Ukraine or any number of places, or even in the streets in the UK, I think people desire to know more about what's going on. And I follow Google Trends quite religiously, and you can see sustained uptick over time in a lot of these topics in terms of how they influence our world and the way that we live our lives. So we wanted to do a series with experts, going to universities, etc., and getting them doing long form interviews on subjects and topics and getting their view on it, so we can also put that out. And then beyond that, we want to really start producing some other more in-depth pieces that really sort of bring the facts to people in a way that maybe and hopefully they enjoy.
Amazing, sounds great. Wish you the best.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I guess regarding like individuals, what can individual people do to engage with the media they consume in a better way?
That's a good question.
I think in terms of, I'll answer it in two ways. I know you didn't answer the question, but in terms of media, I think one of the best things that people can do is have a broad media diet if they can. They can read anything from the Canary to the Financial Times, and I think still be okay. I think at the same time, people should probably also look up how to analyze sources, what it means for a source to have a particular provenance, style, tone, funding, outlook, what's missing and what's included too. I think in terms of choosing what political media to engage with, I think empathy is a pretty good guideline in terms of your own sense of how you feel when you consume certain things. Do you feel like you're being led down a particular path to see somebody or a group of people in a particular way or not? I think that can also be quite a good metric too. And then in terms of being like politically useful, I think, well, one, you got to take care of yourself. So I think people should, go for the career, make sure, they have, friends, family in their life. If you want to date. If you want to have religious experience, go for it. And, exercise, drink water, all the normal stuff. And then at the same time, I think once you've taken care of yourself or you're at a good baseline or foundational level, then I think it's time to almost pour back into the world what the world pours into you. I think even if it's, say, university, the roads that you walk on paid for out of general taxation to some degree. Everything that we enjoy is based off, I think, the struggles and sacrifices of millions of other people, many of whom we'll never meet or see. So I think we almost owe it to them in some sense to give back.
Yeah.
Did LSE influence your career goal?
I'd say so. In terms of like the life experiences that I had at LSE, they were quite good. I think some of the lecturers I had were quite good. David Graeber comes to mind in that sense. And I think also just, it was a good place for me to be able to push back just in terms of some of the stuff I came to university with, in terms of some of the preconceived ideas I had about the world. And it also taught me that I wasn't the smartest person in the room. I wasn't the best at every subject. And that humility, I think, goes a long way. So that's probably the biggest gift I'd say I took from LSE.
Yeah.
I'll say slightly more lighthearted question.
Go for it.
Why is it that you sometimes wear
Honestly, I think it was a day where I was just like, it was a really cold day out and we were doing a shoot or something like that. So, but I only had the one glove on me. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to let this hand freeze off. So in between shots, I'd like have the hand in the pocket and have the other glove out. But then for whatever reason, because the internet is the way it is, some people see that and they're like, yo, is he a Freemason? Is he in the Illuminati? You know, who is this guy? Who funds him, et cetera, et cetera. And so partly, I mean, it's a bit of an antagonistic thing at this point, but so I maintain it.
Yeah.
What is one of the preconceived ideas that you had of the world before, and like what changed it?
My goodness. I mean, I'd say when I was younger, I had all sorts of ideas that I no longer share. Maybe some of it was based off the particular religious tradition that I came from. I had, I think, a narrower view of people's genders, sexualities, things of that nature. I think I had, but also I think you sort of have a sort of parochial view until somebody comes along or something comes along that challenges you in that way, shape. And so it could have been, for example, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. It could be, for example, how certain people see Ukraine. And I think time and again, with all sorts of things, it's just forced me to confront it. So for example, I don't know that necessarily I took the issues that transgender people face as seriously as I do today, based off my interactions with many of them, but also some of the studies and statistics and things that I've read. I don't know that I saw all sort of struggles for liberation in the same way. So for example, one of the modern, I think, limitations of a lot of progressives is their inability to hold space for groups and people that they think either have too much empathy from the rest of the world or in some cases not enough. So there's people I know, for example, who won't spare a thought for a Jewish person who's scared to go outside because they think they might be stabbed or attacked. It might be somebody who, because of their particular anti-colonial viewpoint, has started to see Russia as somehow some sort of beacon of hope and liberty for the rest of the world, and failed to see that for Ukrainians, because I've been to Ukraine, I went last year towards the tail end, and you can see, you know, war's not like a joke. It's not something to be debated on social media. It's not, this is people's lives. And I think when you look somebody in the eye and you know they've lost somebody, you know, that their parent, their uncle, somebody has been taken away from them, then all the sort of rhetoric and, you know, back and forth debate to me sort of becomes a bit meaningless, because it becomes about what are you actually trying to do to help somebody. And I think that really forces you to confront a lot of the limitations sometimes of your own thinking. Because even if you can't conceive of something, or if you can't intellectualize your way around something, or if you don't even know enough about a subject, you can at least start with the human subject, which I think is universally accessible. Yeah, go for it.
Kind of a bit more personal, but linking to that. To what extent do you think people actually have control over choosing to think critically? Like, do you think people are shaped by their experiences? Do you believe in free will, that type of thing? Just kind of one.
Makes sense, makes sense. I have this debate with my father all the time. Sometimes I go to his house and it was 6 p.m. and then before you know it, it's 6 a.m. When it comes to free will, I think, you know, say you were to define it as people's ability to make choices unencumbered by previous circumstances, or however you want to define it, then I think free will, autonomy, is a sliding scale. You know, I think I'm not of the view of a sort of B.F. Skinner that you can sort of just program an individual in a particular way, and then, you know, if you say jump, they'll say how high and also jump for you too. There's one professor, I think Peter Ulrich Say or something like that. He believes in this idea of like filtration. So if I say to you, female politician, your brain will do a certain amount of filtering for you. You might choose one of a particular number of options, but the framework, if you like, was a bit limited, you know. So you're not going to think Boris Johnson. You might, but but I think you'd be wrong. So in that sense, I think if you see it as a bit more of a spectrum or a bit more of a sliding scale, without knowing whether or not it's a case of, you know, the action potential forms before somebody's aware of what they're going to do or anything like that, you can start with the circumstances around how people make choices. So in the case of democracy, you're talking about how money and power influence, if you like, the Petri dish petri dish, or however you want to pronounce it, that enables people to make decisions. So if we know, for example, we did an experiment on X not too long ago when it was found that it was making child sexual abuse material through Grok, where we made like an account, and other organizations have done this too, and tried to see how long it would take before you saw something that was either extremely violent or illegal in some way, or not safe for work, right? And we're talking about, in one case it was like 30 seconds, in another case you're talking about 2-3 minutes, in another case maybe a bit longer, 10 minutes, but the point being that what you saw was, if you like, far beyond your own control. You could log into that at almost any point, or be in any classroom or place as a teenager, and what you're going to experience is being shaped by algorithms that you have very little say over and very little influence over. So if free will is a spectrum of some sort, or you are autonomous to one degree or another, then these are forces that are acting or impinging on your ability to make freer decisions, if you like. I don't believe anybody's completely free. You can't escape your past, you can't escape your epigenetics, you can't escape your genetics to some degree, but there are degrees of freedom. And I think we know that in some deep sense because of how unpredictable our world is, and the people in our lives are too. Go for it.
So given it's a spectrum, what do you think is a valid reaction to people that are unwilling to change? Like,
Love. I think if there's one thing I agree with Jesus on, and I think there's many things to agree with Jesus on, if the gospel depictions are accurate, is love. Love one another as God has loved you. And I think that's an easy thing to say. I think it's a harder thing to do. And I think one of the best ways that you can do that is through that empathy principle, is can you see that other person on the other side as a human being? I've had people call me anything from the N-word to hoping any future children I may or may not have die, or death threats and all this kind of thing, and that's sort of run of the mill. But in that, I find it difficult to take it personally. When I do, I have people around me to remind me not to take it personally, because I could have been any Tom, Dick or Harry on the street and they could have still had the same view, which tells me that it's less to do with me and more to do with circumstances that impact or affect them, or a particular trajectory in their life. And what is it? I was in an Uber on the way here today, and a man's telling me about how he was caring for his father up to a particular point. And I think almost every day I'm reminded in some way, shape or form that there are invisible struggles that people face that you'll never know. So how can I meet them with anything but empathy? You know what I mean?
Any more questions?
Do you have any political role models?
I'd say a couple. I'd say the list sort of grows as time goes on. Althea Lecointe-Jones in the UK, she was part of the British Black Panthers. I'd say there's contemporary people like Akala. And I think, role models I struggle with. Me and my sister have this conversation quite a lot, which is that I don't think the term I think almost is too universal. It's too, how can there be somebody that you would model almost everything on when you can't know anything or everything about them? I think I say Muhammad Ali. There's a lot in his example that I love and appreciate, him standing up for himself, freedom of expression, religion, etc. And at the same time, the more you learn about, say, a person like Muhammad Ali, the more you learn that, sexual relationship with children. So in that way, I don't really have role models, but I'd say there are people who model behaviors that I like, that I imbibe, and I believe in. And I think there's an Islamic credo like that you separate the good from the evil, and you do what's good and then you leave what's bad. And I think that's rules to live by when it comes to any individual or person, because you'll never know the full circumstances.
Any final question? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm out. Keep them coming.
Just I don't know where I'm going with this, but how much information, or what do you think would have to be revealed to us for people to actually kind of take a stand for themselves and say no to all the corruption that's going on in the world? Because you see this new things being uncovered constantly, and it just seems like everyone keeps on moving on with their life. Obviously, what else would they do? But yeah, just what do you think about that?
I think there's two ways to see it. And one way, I get what you mean in that there's a certain passivity to the way people seem to move through life sometimes, almost that life is happening to you as opposed to you are living. The chances of you being here are like slim to zero. And you know, you have these senses and sights and, you know, the whole thing's amazing if you think about it. And I think on one level, again, coming back to that thing about how circumstances shape people, it's hard to fault people for things that were shaped by, you know, circumstances, places, times, historical moments that they couldn't possibly know of unless they were given the opportunity in some way, shape or form. But I think in terms of when people will realize or recognize certain things, I think, you know the Mike Tyson quote of everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face? I think in some ways that's how life comes at people fast. So I think one of the ways in which people sort of get awake to what's going on with them is that something very real either happens to them in a personal way. You know, so you hear stories of people who didn't care about violence against women and girls until it happens to somebody that they knew or that they know. Or it will be, they didn't understand X, Y, and Z until they watched a movie about it. So I think there's something in which tangible confrontations with reality result in either one or two things. Somebody maintaining cognitive dissonance from then until maybe the day that they die, or they are forced to change and confront their view, which is why I think the political process doesn't just call for people to be engaged with it in a digital sense, but also to get out on the streets and put bodies in place too, because it's very difficult for you. I know this because right now, for example, I work in the litigation space in employment law, and I know it's very difficult for somebody to say no to a product I'm selling them if I call them on the phone versus if I just put it in an email, because one is passive and one's a bit more confrontational. And I think that's really, if you like, going to the root of your question, what you need confrontation. I think for people to be able to wake up and see, oh, this isn't right or this isn't correct. And that might come from you.
I do want to ask one small question from just what you just said. I watched the video you released, I think, either yesterday or a few days ago, where you interviewed two young protesters at that reform
Britain First rally.
Britain First rally, yes. Did you see any difference after you talked to them in how they were thinking and how they were in their view?
On that occasion, no, I don't think so. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And I think the key thing really is not about persuasion or changing minds, because it's a bit of wasted energy, I think, often. Instead, it's about, can you have a conversation with a person? Yeah. Can you be in community with that person? Can you be communicating with that person? Can you do it in such a way that your walls aren't up necessarily all the way too? That's in a very individual sense. And in terms of the work that organizations do, then I think it's about whether or not necessarily you're persuading people, but can you push people to confront themselves? And I think that's where real change comes from. It's not necessarily, we're going to have a debate and I'm going to persuade you to my way or another way. I think that can be useful and it has its place, but I think sometimes it can be overrated. I think the far more important thing is, can you be in community with people?
Amazing. Unless there are any more questions. Yeah, sure.
A quick question. I know you mentioned Carla earlier, and he places big emphasis on sort of liberating ourselves through self-education and empowering ourselves through education. How would you sort of reconcile that with people who are sort of structurally faced with a lack of education and sort of face the structural barriers to education?
Well, so I think first things first is I temper my expectations, not necessarily selling them short, because then I think you can also end up stereotyping people, but tempering my expectations in terms of maybe the outer reaches of what I think they're going to necessarily come at me with, or what they're going to experience in their own sort of day-to-day life. But on the second side to that, I think, again, coming back to that idea of community, is whether or not groups can outreach to that person in an effective way. It's about whether you as an individual, whether it's your friends or your family members, can you approach things. It could be a conversation about, women's rights over their own bodies. It could be a conversation about vaccination. It could be a conversation about anything. But can you also do the work, if you like, to get to a point where you can talk to that person as a human being, come with facts, of course, information, data, evidence, and stuff that you've researched and thought about yourself. But can you come to that person, I think, is even the first step. And I think a lot of stuff just happens off the back of it because a lot of the reactions that happen with people, or a lot of the processing, is unconscious. So they're never necessarily, or you're not necessarily going to be consciously aware of the impact that you've had on somebody until you see the fruits of your labor. and you might never see that fruit. And I think one thing, not Akala, but Loki once said to me, is that a lot of this political work is sowing seeds for trees that you might never get to sit in the shade of.
Amazing. Yeah, one more question.
Are there any particular, I guess, life systems, behaviors, habits, structure that you follow yourself to, I guess, self-regulate yourself or make sure that you're in a particular mindset?
I'd say I'm a big fan of the idea of like iteration or like constant little tweaks and improvement and whatnot. You know, so I have a daily schedule, say, and I tweak it. I come back to it maybe in 3-4 months. Can I tweak it again? Can I move this here or there? You know, can my gym routine be different? I think surrounding yourself with people who like challenge you and want to see you be the best version of yourself is really important. I think sort of reflecting on death, it sounds a bit morbid, but it's something I think I've taken a lot of benefit from. Just reminding yourself that this isn't forever and at any point you can go or you can die, you can expire, and so can the people in your life and around you. So are you living in like the fullest way that you can, I think is a great question. And then I think, you know, the basic stuff, you know, are you taking care of yourself mentally, physically, spiritually? And I think, so you can take rules, if you like, from people who've gone before you, you know, so I'm a big fan of Michael Jordan, say I think he's the GOAT. So I look at his life, I look at his life, I look at his routine, I look at things that he did, you know, I might say, look at the sort of relentless questioning of somebody like Socrates and, you know, think to even, you know, go up until death, asking questions and wondering and thinking. And that curiosity, I think, is also a big thing. One thing that you hear from a lot of preachers say is this idea of people trying to still be like children, but that you can get a lot of value from trying to still be like childlike. And I think in many ways, you know, you're a kid, you have all these ideas in your head, you want to change the world, you want to do this, you want to do that, and then the world almost tries to beat it out of you. But to draw from another cliche, this time from Rocky Balboa, you know, it's not about how hard you can hit, it's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. And I think those are rules to live by. But yeah, I think collect rules, search for rules, find rules, and if they work for you, they work for you. And if they don't, keep them moving.
Great, I think that's an amazing note to end on. Please join me in thanking Yisrael for coming today. Thank you so much.
That was fun. Who's your GOAT? No.